Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm giving people a bit of more time to log in. So if any of you need to grab a quick drink before we begin, you've got a bit of time to do so. In the meantime, as always, don't hesitate to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're logging in from. I know we have a diverse crowd in our sessions, so say hello if you can. And also do make sure you can monitor the chat. I know that sometimes depending on the devices you log in from, you might not have easy access to the chat. I will be popping in the chat some links for your CEU keywords for those of you collecting CEUs and some additional bits and bobs. So do make sure you can access the chat um, because you will need it later on. Hi, Amy. You're back in the US. Hope all is well. Thank you for joining. Hello, Bristol. Joining from the UK. Where from the UK? Hi, Clarissa. Hi. Lincoln. Oh, my. Doncaster. Oh, dear, oh, dear. That's a bit far away for me, but I'm sure it's beautiful. Okay, I'm going to give people a couple more minutes and then we're going to get started. Hello, hello, everyone. Hi, Nesta. Hello. Good representation from all across the UK, I see. Good. Glad to hear it. I'm going to put these links in the chat again, but just to give you an opportunity to click on them and let them sit in your browser. Keep in mind, when we conclude the session, the chat goes away. So just click on them now, have them ready to go. So you don't need to worry about it later. The first one is for your CU. The second one is the feedback form for the session. Do make sure, hi, Adi, do make sure that you give us feedback at the end. Okay, so I'm going to start introducing the Tizard Center. So by the time I finish, hopefully everybody will have logged in. Welcome to our monthly behavioral talk. For those of you that know us, you know that we do these, we aim to do this once a month. I'm Thanos Bostanis. I'm a lecturer at the Tizard Center at the University of Kent, and I'm the program director of the master's courses in applied behavior analysis and positive behavior support. Now we have one course that we're rolling out next year. So the ABA and PBS has come together into one. And that is a course that we offer both as campus-based and distance learning. So if you know anybody who's interested in studying applied behavior analysis or PBS here in the UK with us, by all means, let them know. Tizard Center specializes in research for individuals with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. And we also offer additional opportunities. So you have PhD opportunities with us. You have opportunities to publish your work. We have a peer review journal. We call it Tizard Learning Disability Review. And that journal focuses on sharing good practice in the area of intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities, as we call them in the United Kingdom. I will put the link for our website and the Tizard Learning Disability Review in the chat. And I'm just always keen to say, even if you have a case study, even if you have a good example of good clinical practice that you want to share with the world, by all means, do not hesitate to submit to TLDR. We are not only looking for the usual big, randomized controlled trials or whatnot. We are also keen to share good practice because it's a practitioner-focused journal. And it's properly indexed. It has an impact factor. It meets all the criteria that you would expect from a good journal. So today, we welcome Dr. Richling. She is going to talk about mastery criteria, so I'm super excited to learn from her. Dr. Richling, thank you for joining us. As always, I would like to give you an opportunity to talk to us about your most current work, what you're currently keeping yourself busy with. Then take it away. I will only interrupt at 3 points, folks, to deliver the keywords for the CU. So just make a note of those when I deliver them. And at the end, you're going to use the links to add them along with your details and your certification number. And I will email you in due time your certificate. So, Dr. Richling, you're up. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, yes, everyone, my name is Sarah, and I am a clinical associate professor at Auburn University, in addition to the director of our ABA master's program. So as far as my current work goes, I am still dabbling in this area of mastery criteria and generalization criteria. So I help co-direct the Clinic for Autism, Early Intervention Autism here. So I'm running some research down there at all times. Given my role as a clinical associate professor and then also as the director, I sort of have to jump around quite a bit. So my primary role is not of that as a researcher, but it never has been. I've been in the field for 20 years, and my first role has always been that as a trainer, a practitioner, and a trainer of practitioners, but always finding opportunities for the research in that, right? So ensuring that you can take rigorous data and then translate that. So Thanos, as you were talking about the kinds of focus of your journal, that's just music to my ear, because I think that that's the world that I operate in. And I think it's extremely important that people realize that the data that you're taking, the things that you're finding in clinical practice are just as relevant and sometimes even more than the things that are happening in the confines of a very controlled experimental laboratory. So at any rate, that's most of my research is in that kind of area, mastery criteria, generalization. I also work at a juvenile detention facility. So we're working with individuals who have been adjudicated for illegal sexual behavior. I'm not going to talk about any of that kinds of things today, but also dabble in that area quite a bit. When I was being trained at 18 as a behavior analyst at the side as my side gig, I was working at a juvenile detention center, and I was always kind of putting those two things together. And then that my trajectory of just kind of followed that path, that I've always taken those two areas of interest throughout, and there's a lot more blending between the two than one might imagine. In particular, there's a lot of individuals that end up here in the U.S. in the legal system, and they do so because they have been either not diagnosed, or they come from situations in which the idea of diagnostics is not readily known, and unfortunately get thrown into a legal system where the treatment is very different than what we're used to, in our mind of therapeutic interventions. So we catch individuals there quite often. And so it's not just like it's not this idea of bad people that we're confronting. Oftentimes it's people that are just in as much need of help as the ones that we typically are working with. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what I operate or what I'm doing outside of my other typical roles in the university. So as far as the
You are a
presentation.
busy bee, Sarah. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. You are a very busy bee.
Yeah, I like to be. I like to kind of dabble around. So, at any rate, all right. So as far as the presentation today goes, I'm going to talk about the mastery criteria myth. And so this is one area of research that I get very, very interested in. In particular, I like to look at our field through a critical lens, and some of the things that we're doing as practitioners through a critical lens, and looking for evidence that something that we're doing comes out of clinical lore or tradition, and maybe not born out of evidence-based practice. And we're ridden with it, as is every field, right? So you kind of have to be aware and also just be hypercritical. Take everything with a grain of salt, that if somebody's telling you to do something, it may or may not have a sufficient evidentiary base to it. And really the onus is on you to double check that against the evidentiary base to see how much evidence there is. And if there isn't a lot, then even more onus on you to take rigorous data to ensure what you're doing is effective. And we'll get into that a little bit more here. But this is one of those examples of something I stumbled across, which was the mastery criteria practice within behavior analysis. So most of you, if not all, I'm sure are familiar with this term mastery criterion. It's fairly used ubiquitously in the field, both in research and clinical practice. And from my experience, it's not unique to the US. It is a worldwide term that's been adopted within the field of behavior analysis. There are similar terms that can be used in the acceleration world as well for fluency aims, right? So it's the same kind of idea. It is ultimately the degree to which a response must be emitted accurately before we give it this label of mastered or learned, right? And I want to draw your attention to that last part of the definition, which is that mastered component, right? It begs the question of what does it mean to master something? So before we get into like this universal understanding of mastery, I want to first touch base on what it means to behavior analysts to master something. So for us, mastery is usually defined by one's ability to meet these standardized rules, which have been predetermined to indicate that a skill has been learned. And more specifically, I conducted a survey of BCBAs and BCBADs, and we found that behavior analysts define mastery as achieving a certain percentage correct of responses during a teaching context, namely most often 80% or 90%, with 80% being the most common. And then they also defined it in terms of the duration of time across which it must be performed at that level, namely and most often 3 observations or 3 sessions. What is not designated is that on the same day, is it across multiple days, so on and so forth. It's just generally sessions. But if I were to ask a non-behavior analyst, what is mastery? I'd imagine that they're going to respond quite differently, right? They're probably not going to say 80% or above for 3 sessions in a row. Rather, when we take off our behavior analytic hats and we think of masterful behavior, we might think of something like a master chef or perhaps a chess master. But what we probably don't think of is somebody being a masterful dresser if they wore 80% of their clothes for the last 3 days, right? So, like, wow, you're really nailing it on the dressing fact, right? Or you probably wouldn't label me as a masterful driver if I stopped at 8 out of 10 stop signs for the first time just this last week. Right. So doubt many of you are going to feel comfortable driving with me. I'm like, well, I am a masterful driver. Last week, not so much, but this week, 8 out of 10 stop signs. So you're safe with me. So obviously, this term mastery in ABA is not equivalent to the typical way that we would use this word mastery, right? And at this point, you might be asking if the difference between the use of mastery in a colloquial sense being this higher standard than a scientific usage is a problem. And it's not necessarily if the only issue truly is one of a semantic nature. So let me give you an example to show you what I mean here. So it'd be fairly common for one of my students or trainees to come up to me one day and say, so-and-so mastered a skill, such as like mastered matching 3D objects. And what that would look like on a single subject design graph would be something like this. They observed some low-level responding in baseline, started teaching, and then saw that behavior went up until they met some predetermined criterion. And they're saying the client mastered the skill because the client's behavior occurred at least 80% of the time for 3 sessions. And that's what we've been trained is the SD for using this term mastery. The assumption here is that the individual can match objects at 80% accuracy when working with a clinician in our clinic for those sessions that we observe. And that not only will they do it on that particular day or particular session, but that they could come back and do it again the next day and the next day, and maybe at home or at school or with their parent or other relevant contexts, right? That's the assumption that once they meet that goal, they can do it thereafter. So behavior analysts, we say that someone has mastered something the first time they show repeated accuracy, because we assume that meeting that goal means there will be meaningful and lasting change in the long term in the actual environment with the actually important people. But what happens if we come back a week later and they can't master or they can't match the objects anymore? So on a single subject design graph, that would look something like this, right? So we come back a week later, and the behavior has gone back to near baseline levels. And then we say, uh-oh, maybe that wasn't mastered, right? So naturally, as a clinician, we go back to teaching, and then we might see them meet mastery criterion again. And then ideally, we would come back a week later and check, and maybe it doesn't maintain at that point. So we go back on to teaching. And we do that until we get to this point at which the behavior persists during these follow-up checks at some kind of acceptable level, right? And now maybe we can say, okay, now the skill is mastered. So in that previous example, we said that the client mastered matching objects, such as matching a pair of socks after 3 trial blocks of, say, 10 at 80% or above accuracy, which is exactly what we do in clinical practice, right? That's when we apply that term. And unfortunately, as the phrase reaching mastery criterion would suggest, clinicians likely stop there and they don't come back after a week to check to see if that behavior maintains, or they don't check to see if that behavior occurs at the same level of proficiency with a teacher, for example, or a parent, or the sibling, or et cetera. But even in the best case scenario, where the clinician does conduct a check to see if the behavior generalizes, say, to novel stimuli, such as a different pair of socks, or with the parent and in the home setting that's relevant, and they ensure that the individual's behavior persists over time and they maintain the skills that were taught, in addition to maintaining the ability to generalize with these important people, objects, and places over time, we're still applying that term mastery criterion at the beginning, before we observe that maintenance or a generalization, or before we see it occur in the natural context with the natural reinforcers. And as odd as it may seem, that's what we're doing in practice. But in reality, we really need to push that, right? We should reserve that term mastery for later on in the process. And in the interim phases, I suggest utilizing other kind of terminology or the appropriate SDs that signify what to do next, such as an initial acquisition criterion or a generalization criterion, asking ourselves how many different stimuli do we want them to respond to, or how many different forms of the response, with what people and what settings, and then a maintenance criterion. For how long do we need the behavior to persist, especially considering how often they will get the chance to practice in the natural environment and how often it will in contact reinforcement. And then don't forget maintenance of generalization criteria too. Does that maintain, does that phenomenon maintain? And then all of these individual criteria collectively can be referred to as the mastery criterion, right? Like once all of those have been met, then we can say mastery has been achieved. So why does it matter? Well, first, the term mastery criterion, as I said, it functions as an SD that tells the trainer what to do next, right? It's a discriminative stimuli that tells us what's the next step. It indicates you should move on to another prompt level, or maybe you should stop training altogether, or move on to maintenance, or teach new skills. So mastery as a word seems to suggest that learning is done, when in fact you're not done. And there's still potentially a long road ahead. So it's like we're communicating to our technicians, you're finished, but check the asterisk, because not really. Like, read that fine print, there's still more to do. But maybe learning being done at that point isn't an issue. So if we stop, we don't do that 1 week check afterward, maybe it's okay. So if we accept that in ABA, mastery means meaningful, lasting behavior change in the natural environment, and we've defined mastery as 80% or for 3 sessions or above, or 80% or above for 3 sessions or more, then that should, by logic, result in lasting behavior change in the natural environment. And if that were the case, there'd be no issue with the use of this term as it stands. So I just gave you one example where it was not working after a week, but what if it did, right? So that is, what if we taught to an 80% criterion for 3 sessions, the behavior didn't decrease, rather it just reliably stayed at high levels. And what if there was research that showed that this pattern was observed over and over again across different people and different skills? Well, great, right? But at least from what we've seen, that's not what happens, or at least not reliably enough to make it this kind of gold standard rule that applies to everybody. So here's some data from one of our earliest studies on mastery criteria. So in this study, we evaluated across several experiments. We taught various skills and evaluated 80%, 90%, or 100% for 3 sessions. We also threw 60% in there as sort of like this lower level comparison. And so you'll see that with the circle there, the 100%, 80%, or 60%. And I realize this is probably pretty difficult to see, so I'm going to highlight some things here for you. We're mostly looking on this right-hand side. And so pay attention to that. That's our follow-up data. So we're looking at weekly increments post-teaching, right? On the left-hand side, that's our teaching to the various criterion levels. And the right, we're following up every week to see if they're maintaining it at those various criterion levels. So what I've got circled here across the 4 different participants from top to bottom is the 80% criterion. So if we're looking at the top one, Sandy, you see that just 1 week after meeting an 80% criterion, it's fallen down to 0, right? And that continues, that pattern continues. Evan, it's sitting around 30%, eventually falls down to 0. Cyril, he actually does okay, right? With that 80% criterion, it hangs in there. In fact, it gets up to 100%. It had a little dip at first and then goes up, which might seem odd, right? Like why, like that might be the case, but we actually saw that pattern quite a bit, that in the second session back, there would be a little bit of an increase. That might be extinction. That we're seeing there, an extinction burst potentially, just motivation differences on that, not quite sure. But regardless, if we move down to Adam, we look at those levels. Now those are sitting, I wouldn't say they're great, but when I'm comparing it to the 0 levels, like, oh, okay, like Adam fared a little bit better, right? I also want to point out here Evan's data. So the one I have circled there is the 60% criterion. The 60% criterion actually worked out better for Evan than the 80%. And so you might be asking, like, how does something like that happen? Well, it's because in this research, we're not evaluating what happens to behavior once it meets a steady state level of responding. So we're not saying behavior has to occur at 80%. We're saying what happens when the independent variable is applied to the trainer, not the client, when the trainer's behavior changes as a result of the 80% or above, meaning that the client's behavior is free to flow at 80% or above. So even though I set a 60% criterion, the client might be performing at 100. It's not like we stop them and say like, no, get the next 3 wrong, because we're only interested in what happens when you perform at 80. So I think that's an important distinction of this research, is it's really an independent variable that's applied to the trainer, not an independent variable that's applied to the client. So that's how you get something like that criterion fares better in that circumstance. All right, so we saw this pattern repeat in a second experiment in this study with a different type of skill. And again, here we moved the target to 90% for 3 sessions in a row. And overall, either 80% or 90% was working out in this study to produce behavior that maintains near those levels after a week, about 50% or less of the time. And that's a heck of a gamble to take. So to orient you here, the ones that I have circled this time are the 80% criterion. Sorry, 80% criterion. Oh, is that the same? Yeah, 80% criterion, and it's working out about half of the time for these individuals as well. So, but maybe it was just this set of kids in this experiment and these particular skills or the particular strategies that we adopted. There might still be some research out there that shows that it works if that's why everyone's doing it, right? Or at least this was my assumption when I was being trained on mastery criteria even 20 years ago. And I'll say that I've been exposed to those same rules in every setting that I've been in, every supervisor for the last 20 years, and I'm sure many of you have experienced them as well. So just as I assume, there's got to, assume there's got to be some data support for it if everybody's running around and doing it and it's like a worldwide phenomenon. We're all talking about it this way, right? But it's just not the case. So before that first study, there was not one research study in ABA that directly evaluated these very commonly used mastery criterion rules. Rather, you would find it sort of in like these clinical texts as a suggestion, right? And so it begs the question of where did it come from initially, right? Now it's possible that it was derived potentially from like our notions of a bell curve, a normalized bell curve, or we're adopting it from the teaching world where 80% B's get degrees, 90% are A's, something along those realms. I'm not sure. And it's also possible that clinicians were utilizing it or derived it there, and then they were seeing that it worked. So that's like the best case scenario in my head is like, okay, well, it worked. So that's why they were adopting it. That necessarily didn't have to be this research there. But anyway, along we trudged, we continued to conduct this research. And we went back and we replicated that first study with a different set of participants, different ages, this was a different state within the US, different diagnoses, different teaching targets, and different teaching strategies. Like, for example, in the first study, we used a least to most prompting hierarchy. When I submitted that for publication, everybody jumped on that, like, who does that? Who would do a least to most? I'm like, I don't know, I guess we did, but and that was common practice. So then we went back and replicated, like, okay, I guess we'll do a most to least and see what happens there. There's actually a podcast on this study out there by one of my former students, Emily Longino, so you can check that out if you want to, and we go to more depth about the nuances of this study. But for the sake of today, just check out that 90% criterion and the 80% criterion on this one. I have circled the 80% criterion. 90% does better when paired with a most to least prompting hierarchy. Right, both did pretty poorly with the least to most, but 90% does better if you do most to least, or at least in this, set of individuals. There's only 3, so I don't want you to derive some major rule out of that. It's just like, well, that was the pattern for these 3 individuals. But 80%, still only 1 out of 3 maintain levels near that criterion level. So still a pretty big gamble, right? That if we utilize that 80%, regardless of the teaching strategy we might utilize. So in fact, since that study, there have been quite a few studies that have been conducted that all show relatively similar results, which provides a segue into the next section of the presentation, where I'll talk about how we approach research in this area and briefly outline how our data demonstrate that adopting these ubiquitous rules, such as 80% accuracy across 3 sessions, is really problematic, and that we need to look much more skeptically at the individual components of our teaching context, not only in isolation, but also holistically and how they operate contextually together. In particular, the components which have largely been derived from tradition or lore rather than empirical research. So first I want to talk a little. Yeah.
Before you crack on, let me deliver the first keyword. Folks, if you're collecting CEUs or CPD, the first keyword is criterion. I repeat, the first keyword is criterion, as we say, performance criterion, for example. Okay. I've also put the podcast in the chat for those of you who want to check it out. And I'm saying this for the recording because the chat is not going to be visible. It's the Behavior Analysis in Practice podcast, season 4, episode 7, published in the 1st of September, 2023. Okay. Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Thank you. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how researchers in this area arrange experiments to evaluate teaching components and offer, in my opinion, a perspective on how to interpret those research findings that's relatively important. So as an analogy to begin, I want you to envision a teaching context as a collection of gears. So we're sitting down at the table, wherever it may be, we're utilizing certain kinds of components of teaching. I want you to envision that all as gears coming together, which, if working properly, result in the desired outcome of occurrence of a socially significant behavior in the natural environment, maintained by natural contingencies, which maintains over time and generalizes to these novel contexts and such, right? Now, let's break that down a little bit, that teaching context. Every component of the teaching context functions as another mechanism for behavior change, working in tandem with the other components. For example, you might have a specific teaching format, the number of trials, the stimulus set size, the specific type of discriminative stimulus you use, the type of prompting hierarchy you choose, the skill you're teaching, and the schedule of reinforcement. Now, each of these components may have some degree of some empirical support, and if you're lucky, it all works out, right? But if one of those components is poorly chosen, for example, the response is not something the individual is physically capable of, or the prompting hierarchy is ineffective, the gears won't produce the desired outcome, right? And the truth is that in this line of research, when there are variations of a single component, and when I say this, the line of research, what I mean is looking at individual teaching acquisition components, right? Like different prompting procedures, our evidence base gets smaller. And there's even less evidence to support unique combinations of components. Usually a single treatment package is compared to baseline responding, rather comparisons of the various treatment components. So like there might be things that are often held constant in research. So even if we're looking at most to least versus least to most, the mastery criterion that they utilize in that study is still relevant to the teaching context, but they haven't varied that, and they haven't seen if the least to most works as that varies, if that makes sense, right? So that's what we're attempting to do with the mastery criterion, is we're attempting to systematically manipulate and compare the variations in mastery criterion as an independent variable, and also study that in combination with the other features of the teaching context. So everything I say today, when I say 80% or above doesn't work, you're going to naturally be like, oh, cool, that's my new rule. It doesn't work. Or 90% is better with most to least. Cool, that's my new rule. Except take it with a grain of salt, because that's only as you're considering what other components of the teaching context we had in place in that particular experiment. If you varied any one of the other pieces of the experiment, that may no longer be the rule anymore. So for at least this study that I originally presented to you, the first one, we found 80% or 90% correct for the 3 sessions was largely ineffective for producing response maintenance under these specific conditions of 10 trials, with a given stimulus set size, with least to most, that we use visual discriminative stimuli, that the format was mass trial training, and a VR schedule of reinforcement rather than an FR1, for example, right? And in this one, it changed, right? It's most to least. We used tax, then it was 10 trials still. In one of the other experiments conducted by one of the other individuals, they had 20 trials. It was still most to least. It was tax. It had a certain schedule of reinforcement, right? So each of those varied from study to study. In this one, Christina Wong, I believe they also had the number of trials, right? And then in addition to that, in this study, they looked at teaching stimulus sets versus single operands and applying the mastery criteria to those sets, which is pretty interesting because she stumbled on something else that is kind of a tradition or a lower in behavior analysis, is where we take these operands and we put them together in a stimulus set. And we say, I'm going to teach matching. And in my set, I've got 5 different objects, which means that in a 10 trial block, they're experiencing each of that object 2 different times. And then I set the criterion for the entire set. But it's very possible for me to achieve 80% on the entire set, but achieve 0% with respect to one of the objects. And it's once you aggregate that data, you lose that level of analysis where I can evaluate maybe they're failing at one component of that set. Whereas if we apply these rules to an individual operand, right? So 10 trials of the same object, and then another 10 trials of a different object, right? Rather than putting them together, then I'm going to see the specifics of where they're erroring. So she found in that one that it was better to apply it to the single operands than the whole set. And the idea, or my initial response to that would be, well, we do it for efficiency. Well, at least in this study, it was no more efficient to apply it to the individual operants than it was to the entire set. And in fact, you got better maintenance and generalization when applying it to the single operant. So in the long run, it's probably more efficient to not have stimulus set sizes. And it's another whole question that there's other researchers that look at this too. It's like, how big of a stimulus set size is okay? Is it 3? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 20? And how does that change things? But again, knowing the bigger that your stimulus set size is, the less precision you're going to have in predicting how well they're going to do on any one of those individual operants, and you'll lose that as you aggregate the data into a percentage. So overall, over a variety of papers, we've learned that in general, you need to program for at least 90% to 100% in order to see maintenance under extinction conditions. But note what I just said. Even though you might be tempted to use this as your new rule for mastery, it really depends on the whole context, which we'll talk about more as well a little bit later. The paper by Schneider shows that it's not enough to consider just the level, but also there's a whole other thing, the number of observations. Recall I said they're doing 80% or above for 3 sessions in a row, or it could be 90% or above for 2 sessions in a row. So how much does the number of observations matter? But in her paper, she utilized 15 trials, whereas the others listed 10 or 20. And so why would that matter? Well, it's a number of reinforcer deliveries. So we know that there's a direct relation between the number of times that a behavior contacts reinforcement and the extent to which that behavior would maintain over time. So if you've got 20 trials, then there are 20 reinforcer deliveries. If you've got 10 trials, there's 10 reinforcer deliveries. So the maintenance of the behavior that's been exposed to 10 reinforcer deliveries versus 20, even though it's labeled as a session, might differ directly as a result of just that, the number of trials that are included, right? So several studies also with college students have been done to confirm what the other studies show, and they do. The higher the criterion level, the higher maintenance, and the higher number of reinforcer delivery, the higher number of maintenance. So in 2022, we decided to do a meta-analysis of all of the not all, but a good deal of published papers in behavior analysis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But we wanted to evaluate mastery criterion as each of those other components were varying. And overall, what we found was that the higher criterion level, higher the maintenance, regardless of these other components of the teaching context. Again, I'm going to go into more detail on that in just a second. But and finally, the last takeaway point here is that there's this tradition, as I said, to use sets of skills like the 10 trials of imitation, but that set includes 3 different imitative responses. Why do we do this? And again, like I said, probably because we believe it's more efficient, but this recent literature suggests that it's not. So we want to question why we do that as well. All right. All right, so here's back to that meta-analysis study I was just referencing. In 20 and 22, we conducted a study where we extrapolated data from 3 years of published research across several of the gold star scientific journals, and we found some interesting things there. So first, as we were sorting, we found that only 50% of the published skill acquisition research in behavior analytic journals included any follow-up data to see if skills maintained after that initial teaching phase. Which is like saying we met the initial acquisition criterion, but we really don't have any idea what happened even a day after that. And after seeing this data well, at least personally, after seeing the data that I have in that 1-week follow-up, it starts to make me question all of our skill acquisition research out there if they don't include maintenance. I'm like, uh-oh, does it really work? Or what does it mean to work? Because we're defining it by meeting some mastery criteria now. And so we have this whole list of all of these skill acquisition studies, and every one I'm like, gosh, we have to redo every single one of these studies. There's where I should start like my whole research line, right? Just go down the list, check, does this work? Does this work? Do a maintenance, right? Or do the generalization. So, and then second, less than 50% of the studies evaluated if the skills taught generalized in any meaningful way, such as to other environments outside of the experiment, other people, other training contexts, which again is a problem in and of itself, right? So how are we defining what works? We say ABA works, but how are we defining? Well, we're defining it by these criteria, which are stopping short of the goal line pretty significantly, I would say, oftentimes. And only 30% of the skill acquisition articles included both maintenance and generalization. So the study shows that a technique employed could get the participant to a certain level of performance, or mastery as we call it, but the extent to which it's actually mastered in any meaningful way is relatively unknown in our research base. So this is a little bit odd to look at. I'm not sure if I love it exactly, but this is what we went with. But of those that did keep going past, this is a cumulative graph of all of the research, right? So of those that did keep going past an initial mastery criterion finish line and collected data on maintenance, so we've got about 1/3 stopped taking data at 2 weeks or less. So that means like of all of the studies that we looked at, 1/3 of them took maintenance data for 2 weeks or less. The ones that took it, that is. And the majority, 70%, stopped taking data after 4 weeks or less. So that also encapsulates that initial 30% that I was talking about, right? So it's 4 weeks or less. It could be 2 weeks. It could be one. Another way to look at that is about 30% took more than 4 weeks. And then I don't know how many of you can relate to getting at least a B in a class, as I mentioned before, or even an A at 90%, and then forgetting almost all of it several weeks later. But it's very possible that's what could be happening with things that we're teaching in an ABA setting as well. We don't really know all that well. So we do have some of the research that's going past that point in terms of maintenance, but the majority of it, the best that we're getting is 4 weeks or less. And as far as, like I said, as all of the other components vary, what kind of outcomes do we get specific to the mastery criterion levels? And then we extrapolated the maintenance of those skills. As far as individuals, and I've encountered this after presenting this research, that people look at it and they're like, okay, so we need to have lower standards. It's we shouldn't have people meeting an 80% or 100% criterion. And I can understand that in a certain way, but I would say there is something else that you need to change. It's not the criterion level, right? Like maybe it's the skill that you're teaching, not the expectation of the level. Because for those of that are arguing for a lower level and we lower the standard, all you're going to get is lower level performance. So just so you know that almost all of those skills that you teach that level are just going to continue to occur at those levels or worse at 0, right? And for the traditionalists that want to stay right where they are and they want to continue using that 80% to 89% criterion, just know that the chances of the skills maintaining at that same level aren't very likely. So if what you really want is 50% or less accurate performance, great, teach to 80%. If you really want, you're like, okay, I'm okay with anywhere from 0 to 50% performance, teach to 80%, right? But these data suggest that overall, that with all of the variables being held equal, that is age, diagnosis, skills, teaching strategy, et cetera, your best bet is to set initial acquisition criterion of at least 90%. So if what you really want is 80%, teach to 100. Expect deterioration, right, over time. Expect that it's not going to continue at those same levels, but your best chance of it continuing at high levels is going to be to set it at that 90 to 100% criterion. So again, I know when I say that some of you are going to say, great, eureka, mastery is 90%, simple. Okay, out with 80, in with 90. And if you did, I suppose that would be better. However, that's not really the point of what our data saying or our individual data is saying from our research or my interpretation of it, or really I think what it is at the core to be a behavior analyst. It just says that on average, that should work out a better percentage of the time. But on the individual basis, it depends. Right. So this begs the question of why are we so compelled to find these ubiquitous or standardized rules? Standardization starts to occur, and we see more of it in behavior analysis as the field grows. And I suspect it's probably because we're trying to service as many people as possible. We're trying to disseminate information in an effective and efficient way. And it also becomes more monetarily or more necessary to become more efficient monetarily and time-wise due to like billing issues in the US. And so then standardization kind of helps with those things. And it's fine. Standardization is fine in and of itself. There's nothing evil about standardization. As long as the intervention is so robust as evidenced by this tons and tons of research, right? Like, so you have to have that evidence base in order to turn it into a standardized rule. And if you don't, well, then the standardized rule is not going to apply. So why doesn't it work in ABA, or at least not yet? Well, we're a really young field, right? And there simply is not the amount of data needed to be confident in our outcomes in that same way. We don't have that robustness. In ABA, we know there's a replication crisis where we just don't have a great deal of studies being replicated over again to make these kind of general rules. And to add to that problem in practice is that oftentimes, because of these constraints of times, ABA technicians are maybe acting as if there is a strong level of confidence, and they're not taking the rigorous data to see if things are working out, and thereby not getting the feedback directly that it's not working out. So then they just continue to believe that it is working out, right? So we really need that follow-up data to ensure that at least our technicians are kind of getting able to evaluate in the moment what's effective or not effective. And really, truly, we should know better as behavior analysts. We are very much aware that averages do not necessarily apply to individuals. That's one of the cornerstones for why we use single subject designs and not group statistics when we're evaluating interventions, right? We know, for example, if you were to take the measurements of every single person's body across the world and then average them all together and make the perfect pair of pants, one singular perfect pair of pants, then there's going to be a whole lot of people walking around the world with poorly fitting pants when you apply them to the individual level, right? Or we know that if we took those same average body measurements, we used them to create this perfectly sized car, that some of us, such as myself, probably couldn't reach the gas pedal, and then some of us might not be able to fit comfortably inside. Right. So that's why we make the seats and the mirrors and the steering wheels adjustable. That's why we have a variety of sizes of clothing too. And our program in behavior analysis is adjustable as well. But we need that single subject data. We need that follow-up data to see if it's working out. So, right, like that's trying it on for size. We have to take the maintenance and generalization data to find that out and then individualize it from there.
All right.
So then you
Can I quickly interrupt for the second keyword?
Yeah.
So folks, the second keyword is yellow, as in the color yellow. I repeat, the second keyword for your CU is yellow. Thank you.
All right. So now you might be asking yourself, where do I begin, right? So where do I set those criteria? And I would say begin with the end in mind. And actually, as I was checking out the talks that you guys have on YouTube, I saw that there was one by Dr. Matthew Lewin, and he was an old grad school colleague of mine. And I saw the title of his talk was something to that effect, like begin with the end in mind. And I was like, oh, wow, that's wonderful. I did not check out the talk yet, but I want to. Matthew is brilliant, though, so I'm sure he has some great stuff to say. And I'm fairly confident that it probably relates to what I'm talking about here. But suffice it to say, just think about what you want the behavior to look like in the end, and then adjust your criteria from there. So don't think about the rule, but think about what am I trying to achieve. So for example, if you're looking to be teaching someone to cross the street and look both ways, well, you might want to set some pretty high criterion levels there, right? Like I don't know that 20% is going to be sufficient or 80%, right? We're going to do 100%. We're going to want to generalize across various streets in the presence of different people, right? Because somebody's life is at stake. Or if you're going to teach someone to perform surgery, you might want to consider teaching to some pretty high standards and be checking for maintenance and generalization a lot, right? But if you're going to be teaching a young child to respond when you call their name, maybe it's okay if we don't hold them to this 100% or 80% standard, right? Like that's just maybe not age appropriate or level or context appropriate. We don't have to apply the rules in the same kind of way. So sometimes I think that our criterion are too low, and then sometimes I think they're too high. So we'll go back to what I said before is like, should we lower our standards? Sometimes yes, right? Like sometimes we should, but what we're looking for is comparing it to what it should look like in the environment, right? Not comparing it to some standard of mastery or perfection, right? So at any rate, that might be a case where less would be more, or less would be okay. Or maybe I'm teaching my daughter to brush her teeth right now. Maybe not 2 minutes. Maybe we can approximate that. I'm just happy sometimes if we get the toothbrush in the mouth, right? So it doesn't have to be 100% of the time, exactly 2 minutes. If I were to hold myself to that standard, I would not be meeting 100% criterion half of the time either, right? Or, for example, if we're teaching them the capitals of all the South American countries and their flags, maybe again, it's okay if they're not perfect, right? The stakes are not quite as high as they were with the crossing the streets. It all depends. So on that note, I want to introduce you to a decision protocol that we developed that to help guide clinicians through this process of creating, evaluating, and altering treatment protocols, effectiveness in a clinical practice. And so hopefully this will make that process a little bit easier for you to consume. You can find a copy of this in the chapter of this book that this chapter that I authored with myself, Dr. Dan Feenup, and Dr. Christina Wong. So as a first step, as I said, we're going to determine the appropriate performance criteria. And to do that, we're going to think about the end goal and what we want the behavior to look like, where we want it to occur, and with whom. And then we're going to take baseline data on those things, not just on our targets, but under those ideal circumstances with the relevant people, relevant context. And we do this to ensure that we're actually necessary, because maybe they don't do the behavior with us in our experimental setting, but they might do it elsewhere, right? Which kind of renders our experiment a moot point, or our clinical services a moot point. So we want to take that data right off the bat. And if that's the case, well, great. Well, then we'll find some new targets. But assuming that we identify a skill deficit, then we can move on to teaching. Right? And as we're conducting ongoing data assessment, as we do, we see it's not working, then we can modify our treatment. So we can try different strategies, or maybe we decide, along with the stakeholders, that the goal's too high. And we simply have to adjust our expectations for the behavior, or maybe a simpler component of the behavior moving forward before we get to this level. And then eventually, ideally, they do meet their goals, and we go on to assess then for generalization and maintenance, comparing that back to our generalization data, baseline data, to see if that we have achieved generalization. And if we note that the behavior doesn't maintain, well, we should review the literature on how does one program for maintenance. Do we need to fade our reinforcement more slowly? How do we do that? How do we program in to achieve that specific kind of outcome? Same thing is if we don't see generalization, let's review the literature on programming for generalization. Is it multiple exemplars that we're doing? What kind? There's a whole other world here, which I also have another research study on, is what kind of generalization are you hoping for? There's a standardized rule that we use there too for generalization. It's across multiple trainers and across multiple settings. But if I train across multiple trainers and multiple settings, then one, I'm only going to get stimulation across multiple trainings and multiple trainers or multiple settings. I'm not going to get, for example, response generalization. I'm not going to get generalization across specific SDs, right? It's just the trainers and the settings. So if I want trainers and settings, great, then I need to do that. But it also begs the question of how many. We just say multiple. 2, is 2 sufficient? Is it 3? Is it 4? We don't really know. So that's another thing, is what kind of generalization do I need for the specific behavior? And then that determines the rule for the generalization I'm going to program for. Should it be multiple exemplars? Should it be multiple trainers? Should it be multiple settings? So for example, washing my hands, I might want to do different kinds of stimuli and settings because I'm likely to encounter a whole slew of different kinds of sinks and soap dispensers and ways to dry my hands, right? Like, so those things have to be incorporated into that programming. It's not sufficient to teach under one strict set of circumstances, right? And then maybe we want all of those things. We want maintenance, we want generalization, we don't meet each of them. Then we have to incorporate in all of those components to our training context. And then after all that, they meet these goals. Great. Now we can say you're finished. Now you've met these mastery criterion, but not at that earlier stage, right? Not after that first treatment intervention phase. So in conclusion, so I have some final recommendations. Now we've met this finish line. I'm going to recap some main points. One, we have to stop using that term. We have to stop calling it mastery or using that term mastery criterion, right? So instead, we got to refer to, like, call a duck what a duck. Refer to it what it is. It's an initial stopping point on the way to the final goal. So reserve the term mastery for when it really makes sense at the end. Otherwise, we're overselling something that really just might be a gamble, right? And two, one size does not fit all in ABA treatment. I think we have to be reminded of that, right? We have to individualize our goals and our programming, and we have to take the time to adequately evaluate their effectiveness. We have to recognize and really embrace the youngness of our field and what evidence base we have and where it's lacking, and then respond in kind. So the more evidence base there is, great. Then we can become less rigorous in our data collection and practice. But the less that we have, the more we need to have that, right? Like the more onus there is on us to have rigorous data collection. And that's how we protect our clients from it. It's not that, oh, we have an insufficient research base, we can't do anything. We certainly can. You are all individual researchers. Your single subject design is a research design, right? And so you have to be trained in that mentality. You have to think in that mentality. I am a researcher of my client and these contexts with these gears in place, and it is my duty to find out if they work in the end and then adjust if they do not. And lastly, I think I invite you to think about other areas outside of ABA where we might be stopping short of the finish line unknowingly. When we meet some standardized goal without thinking of the actual ideal outcome. So for example, I think about myself as a college professor, and the tendency is there for individuals to utilize quizzes or exams as a standard way for testing knowledge, particularly multiple choice questions. I've got to ask myself, what is the content of the course or really a given lesson, and what behaviors do I want my students to walk away with after that course ends? What level of proficiency do I need them to have in a specific type of behavior? Am I okay with them forgetting most of the information they're after? Which information am I not okay with them forgetting? What is the topography of the behavior that I want them to engage in? Is it selecting a multiple choice answer? Most situations it's not, so I probably shouldn't teach to that skill. I should think about the thing that I want to teach, and then that should be the assessment of if they can do it, right? How can I design my course to ensure the ways that I'm testing for proficiency reflect those eventual outcomes? How can I adjust and make new kinds of assessments? And so then I can test for proficiency that reflect those. And then also looking at the skill proficiency of, like, B's get degrees, maybe, you know, because I know that every single student getting an 80% or B does not necessarily mean that every individual student leaves the class with the same skill set or the ability to retain or apply that same skill set. So particularly as a trainer of behavioral technicians, I teach practicum and I teach a philosophy course. You know, the way that I approach those two different courses is different because the outcome or the kinds of skills I need them to derive from it and the proficiency at which I need them to engage in that behavior, because the stakes might be higher in one case or another, it's going to differ. So I'd invite you guys to think about that as well. All right, and with that, that is all I have, and I have time for some questions. I'll stop sharing to see if I can check out the chat.
Brilliant, thank you. Guys, the last keyword is outcome. I repeat, the last keyword for your CU is outcome. I'm adding the CU form in the chat. As I said at the beginning, make sure you click on it, let it sit in your browser, because when we conclude the session, the chat is going to go away. And this is the link for the feedback form. So please do share your feedback about the session with us as well. Any questions for Sarah? Sarah, thank you very much. That was fabulous, and it raises many valid points, and it kind of shows the need for more research in this area. And it's quite exciting that the body of evidence is growing in this. I have to say, I've been talking about your work when I teach the relevant lecture. You know, your papers are part of our reading list, so it's exciting to hear you talk about it in greater detail and to in a way see your broader thinking around this topic. So thank you again. While folks are typing away their questions, just a reminder that this session is being recorded, which means that if anybody wants to go back to rewatching parts of it. I know, for example, that you shared with us that a couple of resources like the book. So if people want to double check that, keep in mind, guys, we're going to put it up in the YouTube channel, so you can always go back and access the recording again. Thank you, Sarah. What do you think is the next? What do you think is next in this line of research? Is our first question.
Yeah, so as I said, we do have a study that's going on right now on the generalization criteria. So we're evaluating the extent to which, if we do 2 settings, 2 trainers, how many exemplars, to what extent do we actually see generalization? So we're taking the same kind of traditional rules and applying this same experiment to that to see if that pans out for us. So that's one area. More is needed on the other individual components. Like I said, like there's just so many different iterations of combining it there. And then I think that there's more to be derived from the extrapolating the data as well. So we've been on another project where we're looking at, as I said, this is an independent variable that's applied to the trainer rather than the behavior. Now we're going back and extrapolating the data of like what the behavior actually was what level it was actually occurring at, and how much deterioration you should expect or plan for. And so looking at that, like actual performance, not a criterion level, and then what happens in maintenance thereafter. So deriving some from that. So I think that's a good direction for it moving forward, is kind of looking at all of those other components and then looking at it in these kind of meta-analyses. And then I think there's also some other research being conducted about there, is like, how do we set these standards too? Like, so it's our normalization standards. So what is age appropriate for what skills? And so some decision-making protocols along those to guide us in like, so we can have a little bit better rules, right? But that they're more individualized rules based on all of the features there.
I've got some other questions coming in. First of all, some people are saying, thank you, really interesting topic. One question says, is this something being looked at, planned for research in schools? Having worked in special education in schools before, it was always challenging when supporting students with mastering criteria initially, but then, for example, after 6 weeks summer holidays, they were not able to demonstrate this to the same level already. So in a way, no maintenance there, and it all made it quite tricky. So could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so Dr. Dan Feenup, Dr. Christina Wong and Dan Feenup are 2 colleagues that I've been working with for a number of years. They have some really excellent work in this area. So I want to give them credit, because like it's hard to even detach my ideas from there sometimes, because we used to meet on a weekly basis. It was kind of this think tank. But Dr. Dan Feenup specializes also in evaluating these things at a collegiate level. And you're not necessarily talking about a collegiate level, but in the classroom settings. And we see those same kind of patterns, right? As the higher criterion, the more likely you're going to get maintenance. But you highlight something else, is like how much time and how much you need to program for. Well, the answer is like, if I want behavior to maintain for 6 weeks, for example, that should be my criterion, right? You meet mastery when you can demonstrate that you maintain the behavior for 6 weeks of time. So maybe I'm teaching at the beginning of the semester, and I'm continuing to teach it. I keep evaluating at 6 weeks, and I find something that's so robust of a teaching that they maintain it for 6 weeks. Or the other is that you just plan that you're going to have to go back and re-deliver reinforcement and reteach to a certain level. I know that there is definitely evidence for year-long schools for this exact reason, because you end up teaching the same content for half of the next school year that you taught the year before, because there's just not that retention of information. But then it goes again back to what I said before, is it depends. Do they need all behavior to maintain for 6 weeks? The ideal is that we're teaching skills that are being used in those 6 weeks. And if they're right, like, so we're teaching skills that are so useful in their life or relevant that they're not just abstract things that they're contacting once a year in the school setting, that our goals are relevant outside of there. So I know that there's kind of a multifaceted answer, but I think there's a lot of things to consider there that you brought up.
Absolutely. Next question, from your meta-analysis, did you guys identify a minimum average of length that should be used to check for maintenance? For example, 20 weeks. And if that meant that they kind of they had to stop practicing the skill, or that they keep using the skill in their day-to-day lives? apparently the graph seemed to plateau, indicating that there might be small benefits past a certain point.
Yeah, again, it depends. If I'm understanding your question correctly, we did not identify a minimum length of time that should be used to check maintenance. It's again, starting with that end goal in mind. And so I briefly mentioned this, but I could talk about this ad nauseum too, is I need to consider what is their natural environment, right? Like in what environment are they going to perform the skill? What is the schedule of reinforcement in that environment? How often are they likely to practice the skill and contact reinforcement? So when we're teaching, we're checking for maintenance as a whole other thing. We're checking under extinction conditions. Well, we know under extinction condition what happens. Things go back down to zero, right? So like if you see that in extinction, it couldn't just be that the person knows how to do the behavior. They're just not doing the behavior. It maintained, but it's just not maintaining because we're not giving reinforcers, right? So that's the longer you go in maintenance, checking under these extinction conditions, the more likely you're going to see zero levels as a result of that. So it begs the question of what is the perfect time to check under extinction conditions. But that aside, I think, again, thinking about that end goal of how often is it going to likely be taught or utilized in other skills? So oftentimes we're teaching these like splinter or these skills that are part of something bigger. We're going to add on it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be at 100% proficiency with no other teaching ever. Because as long as they're continuing to use it and practice it in other ways or as a component of another skill, then likely they're going to contact reinforcement. But something, for example, like I said, crossing the street, that one you might want to get to that 100% proficiency, be checking it quite often, that it maintains. But something that's like a component math skill that they're going to be used in other math equations, maybe that's not as important that they're meeting it and maintaining it for, years and years. I don't know about you guys, but I forgot most of the things I learned in math. And that's when, why we're in behavior analysis, right? I don't remember most of those things. I probably don't need to necessarily. So again, I'm sorry, it's kind of like a nuanced answer there, but no, there is no standardized rule on minimum length of time that you should be checking.
Well, at least you did learn and then forget. What about us that we didn't manage to learn to begin with? But anyway,
Yeah.
my trauma coming back with maths.
Yeah.
Another question says, do you happen to know if there's a difference slash link to competence? And I suppose by competence, we need to first figure out what it means for people in the first place. And in a way, the question links it to maintenance and potentially generalization. So, for example, when training practitioners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you're thinking along the exact right lines there. There is. And so those are the comparable words, competence, mastery, whatever. It's just some level of proficiency that we need somebody to engage in. And when it comes to training practitioners, again, I have to think of like how important is this skill in the bigger scheme of things? And is it okay if they error a lot on it or not? Now, there is a whole line of research in that, right? Like error analysis, but from the extent of the trainer, like on FAs, for example, how many different components of the FA can they error on and still get results? So that's a whole other line of research that you would be looking at when you're making those decisions in terms of like, what is my competence level that I need my trainer to be at with respect to this particular skill of running an FA? What is it with respect to this particular skill, right? I would say when it comes to some proficiency with like ethics things, that's where I have very, very high standards, where I'm like 100% of the time, every time a student says like, what should I do in this ethical situation? And I say, you go to the BACB ethics code. That's what you do 100% of the time. I need you to do that with proficiency, right? Like, and the things that they walk through. So that's something that, it's high stakes because we're protecting our clients at the forefront of that. So it depends on that one as well, but excellent line of thinking.
And one last question, and thank you for taking the time, Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for your presentation. Very interesting. Have you looked at the social significance of the behaviors being taught for the learner as a variable impacting acquisition and maintenance?
Right. Yeah. Same thing, like excellent line of thinking there. And that all depends. And so that's along what I was saying is for that, there's social significance at a broader level of like we're supposed to be teaching socially significant behaviors, but really we have to go back to our behavior analytic mindset of social significance at an individual level. So what's important for this person to know in their lives with their particular values, with where, where they want to go in life, or, their family situations, whatnot. And so those things come into play as well. And I didn't talk about that at all today, but I think that's an important factor as we're talking about mastery, is incorporating in the stakeholders in that conversation as we're talking about our targets and our ultimate eventual goals and outcomes. And stakeholders being the clients themselves too. What level of proficiency do they want to be at? When do they consider themselves a master? In circumstances where it's impossible to get that information directly from them, I think that we need to.
Valid point. Okay. Thank you very much for taking the extra time, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are going to upload this soon to our YouTube channel. Don't email me about your CU certificates, please. I've got 45 days per BACB guidelines to send them to you. So I will, I promise, I always do. Sarah, we look forward to hosting you again in the future to talk to us more about this research or other bits that you're doing. As I said, you're a busy bee, so we are keen to learn more from you. So thank you all for taking the time, and I will see you all soon. Take care.